Well, one of the things, and this is closely related to experience design as well, it's indeed that there's no point in asking people what they want. We do have a relatively good understanding of what the general basic needs are. They never change, but the way that they're actually manifested in different societies, different cultures, that does change. And technology has a big role in those changes. And one of the ways to get insight into this is to is by prototyping, by giving people things to play with, to experience. So the 3D printing is a great example indeed. There's this discussion about a lot of 3D printers, people buy them and then they're on the shelf gathering dust because they haven't quite found a useful need for that. But that's something I think that will evolve over time. But it's an interesting insight. You know, these things sound great, but when you actually get it in your hands, you go, well, actually, what am I going to do with it? But it's not to say that it's bad. That's the first step experience. But then you look at it and go, well, why are people having a problem? Because they actually don't know how to use 3D drawing packages, because they're really difficult. And so you see now that there's a whole range of development of people creating the easy interface to the 3D printer. You've got the sites where you can download the objects, but that's not so exciting as creating your own. So there are now quite a few companies developing more accessible interface where you can download a form and then you can change it to your own needs and then print it. And I think that's the gap that was missing. They focused on the production and forgot to focus on the content. I think basically my main focus is bringing creative thinking, creative processes to innovation. And in a way, this is about bridging the gap between technology and people, which for me is the origins of interaction design, but also now it's evolved to bringing that together with business. So understanding value creation and what that can actually mean for businesses evolving in the future. So for example, the work I did recently with the Eindhoven Council, Parkstrijpe here, on the experience of the lighting at Stripe S. And this was interesting, I think, because it was really focusing on the experience of people in the public space, rather than focusing on the normal elements of the public space, which is the infrastructure, the energy usage, safety. Those are all integrated, but ultimately combined into, but how are people experiencing that, rather than how is that being managed and organized. Thinking about a complete system. So if you think about street lighting, so the traditional way, industrial way of thinking will be you have your lamppost, you have your luminaire on the top, and you have the amount of lumens that comes on the street, and there are guidelines for what this should be. Great, it works well. However, if you have a connected system, if you have a more intelligent system, then you have content. And that content can actually change, it can be dynamic. And then you can actually have an experience in the space that is more reactive to people's behavior, more reactive to environmental conditions, more reactive to many different things that are happening. And then it's the most important part, the value comes from the changing content, so that's how all the different lights behave and change, rather than the physical positioning of lamps and lampposts and lights. Now, I think this is one of the most interesting questions and interesting challenges of this kind of work, because it's in a shift, as I said, from sort of more industrial thinking, product thinking, towards product service thinking, and we're well on the way. But one of the things that then is required is different ways of communicating and different ways of engaging so that people understand. And there we have many tools, like talking about just now, the prototyping, but also using video, making stories. Stories are very powerful to explain because we're talking about designing with time. You can't explain it in one moment in time. So we use storyboards. Is one of the things we've been tackling for a number of years, is how to get the ideas across in a way that they're understood, when a lot of the time thinking patterns are different. And what I mean by that is quite often people are used to thinking in sort of more boxed in industrial object-oriented ways of thinking. And this approach is very more dynamic, fluid and network, and it is a different way of thinking. As we see in the last few years on the Internet of Things, emphasis has been about the numbers. It's how many sensors are connected, and then moving on to how much data. The data is really important. And there's a lot of quantifying the amount, but it's, in my view, it's the wrong end of the value chain. It's the installation end, but actually we need to be quantifying the value end of the chain. So what's the value that's coming out of this? What are the insights we're getting from the data? How are we doing that? Who are we doing it for? And how much value is that creating that they are going to be transacting? And I prefer to use that rather than paying, because there's many other different kinds of transaction that happen. But somewhere in the line, value is being created. But it's really interesting to see that the emphasis of we need to install all of these sensors. We need to gather all of this data. And when you look deeply and ask why, what are you going to do with it, there is a startlingly little insight into the reasons why. And that's really where I'm focused at, really focused on, well, let's start with the value, the need, the insights, and then work back to, okay, from this, we need this data, we need this insight, and this is the kind of things that we're going to do with it. Well, I think one of the things I do actually in order to get this insight into what's happening is just looking at the trends of what people are building, and look at the trends of how that's actually being received. And there's two trends at the moment that are intriguing me, is the smart home and also the wearables. So at the beginning of last year, it was clear that 2014 would be the year of the wearables. And for me, it was really interesting, fascinating to see the speed that they came and almost went. Because the focus was on the object, on the technology. And I'm sure at some point there will be some interesting value. But the question mark that was there is, what is the value? Still hasn't been answered. And they're now seeing research that people will get the wearables, and 6 months later, they put them down. Smart home is heading in a similar direction. It's a bandwagon that everyone's jumping on. But then you see every time we're going to be sensing the temperature, we're going to be sensing movement, we're going to be sensing when your door's open, and it's all the same thing, sensings, and I keep thinking, why? Rather than looking at what do we actually need to be sensing in the home and working back to building those sensors, it's more, these are the sensors we have, let's put them in the home, and then we'll work out what people are going to do with it. Security, fine, it's great, but do we need all of these security systems? Do we need all of these light switches? Yeah. Isn't there something else in our homes maybe that could be more valuable? For me, wearables are a classic example of, I think, looking at the wrong end of the value chain. I mean, I've actually been extremely happy at not wearing a watch for many years, because if I need to tell the time, I have my iPhone with me. And the idea of going back to wearing a watch, it will have to be an added value. And I can see there are values so there's a lot of the health monitoring is interesting, don't you? The sport monitoring, but even those devices seem to be having a short-lived value. But I think all people with specialist health aspects and issues, because you're wearing it on your body, you have it with you all of the time during the day. But then again, I don't know, you have to charge it up every day. It doesn't work. So I've actually been spending quite a time of actually experiencing the crowdfunding journey by being a backer of multiple different types of projects, and particularly a lot of the connected technology projects, but also other ones, to see how that works, and to see the community element. And one that came up recently was really interesting, is a device that basically is packed full of sensors. It's coming out this year, that you can have this, it connects to an app, and there's actually more of these around, that you can decide what you're going to do with it. So, they've got sort of different examples. You can put it in your letterbox if you have a letterbox in the street to see when your letterbox is opened. You can take it when you go snowboarding to actually test your altitude and your speed. But it's being designed to be so usable for non-programmers, non-technical people. Then people themselves will actually work out, oh, hey, this will be really useful. I can connect to somebody else, find out where they are. I can tell how fast I'm cycling. I can tell how many steps I'm doing, so you can make your own applications. I mean, very much like the Arduino, Raspberry, that's in a way been a kind of a forerunner. The slight issue with those is they're not so accessible for people who don't have the time to sit down and read the books and read the step-by-step how-tos. The idea with this device, and also others that are popping up, is it's literally plug and play. And so you see, connected to the type of interaction like the if this then that, that's also great. So it's like, if my door opens, then send me a message. But then the library of the ifs and the thens is getting bigger and bigger. based on what people need, and that gets really interesting. Well, I think the interesting thing that I see popping up with these developments is, rather than, for example, an organisation thinking of an application, one application, we're going to make a product and we're going to launch it, and actually within 6 months we'll discover that it's obsolete. So when you're launching when you're launching products, you almost have to think before you've launched it what the next iteration is going to be. It's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly difficult qua business development. But instead, if you're launching a platform and the ability for people to do what they want with it, then you have something that can grow over time, because it actually fits people's needs better because they are able to tweak it to their own needs. So Stripe S is an area in Eindhoven, quite close to the city centre, and it was formerly an industrial site and was still in the process of being transformed from industrial into really a creative centre. So bringing in small creative businesses, also people coming to live there, and also quite an active sort of entertainment and sports areas as well, all in one region of the city. And so as part of the development, the council was interested in looking at the outdoor space and how that experience could be enhanced with light in a much more innovative way than traditionally. And so we were asked to develop a vision and a master plan. And we did that actually by focusing on the impact of light on people's experiences, rather than focusing on the form of the lamps themselves. Well, I think one of the interesting things, although the starting point was really public lighting, which we're used to as being, a regular grid of lampposts that go on at a certain point in the evening and go off at the end of the night. But when we started by looking at people's experiences, and we looked at very different experiences. We looked from the point of view of somebody just coming to visit a friend. We looked at somebody going to an all-night party at the clock tower, which is quite a sort of like dynamic experience, but also somebody going shopping, or maybe even just doing a sort of skating route around the area. So looking at very different activities. And from that, we then actually came to the conclusion that much more sort of dynamic spatial lighting would have a much more interesting impact on the experience than having a sort of a standard white equal light across the whole area. We actually ended up installing about 10 different projects, and they were ranging sort of on a scale of innovation aims. So from the one which is really all of the street lighting there, that is individually connected to the underground glass fibre network. They can be controlled to be any range of colour and colours of white individually. Right to the other end of the scale, where we also looked into, we were looking into sustainability very much as one of the drivers, and ideally we would have liked to have not had any lampposts, because that's material, extra material. And so we also looked into the idea of flying light. And we developed a prototype drone to actually, in a way, push the boundaries and answer the question of what if light could fly? But rather than just asking the question, we built it because that helps you to get a feeling of what that actually could be, what that means. So we built 2 working prototypes of flying street lighting. One of the interesting things about our flying drone project was we're really pushing the boundaries, and we knew that there was some issues with the legal situation. There always is if you're going really pushing an innovation, but we hadn't expected that we would be grounded. What we had to get flying permission from the local air traffic control. An hour before we wanted to fly, we had to ring them up and tell them we were going to fly. And then, but then it turned out we didn't know that you're not allowed to fly a commercial drone after dark, which meant obviously for flying lighting, our project was grounded. So we were able to fly after that, but only inside the factories here. And actually we've had to go to other countries where they're not so strict to be able to do our test flights. I mean, you see with Uber as well. I mean, basically what their business model is actually challenging regulations. Again, there's some questionable aspects to how they're operating their business model, but they're challenging the status quo. And as soon as they do that, people then run to the court. Then we've got some disruptive innovation going. when you actually start sitting on the boundaries of law. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about big data, again, it's also a way of thinking, a way of looking at it. So there's a lot of emphasis on the data. There's a lot of emphasis on ways of gathering the data, storing the data. But there seems to be also a lack in a discussion of getting the value out of it. What are we doing with it? And I think at the moment there's quite a lot of interest in it giving us insights, and also giving us the ability to automate. There's definitely going to be a shift in the type of jobs with this amount of information. At the moment, there are maybe people that are gathering information in one particular sector, particularly if you think on sort of governmental level. And then there are people that understand the way that that data is gathered and what it means and what to do with it. But if you start looking at big data where all of the information can be combined, and then you're going to get new insights. But this is something that we've never seen before. So you need also really people to understand what this means and how you can get value out of it. Because if you only focus, you've got data and then you've got insights. What are you going to do with the insights? And that's where it gets interesting, because that will impact all of the types of jobs, I think, that we have when it comes to understanding the environment, understanding traffic, understanding city infrastructure, understanding energy, all of the things that actually behave and change through interactions with people or devices or other elements. Now, I think the big data and the way that's analysed, it's too much to expect it to be predictive. In some areas, maybe it can be very helpful, but the ultimate prediction will still need to come from people understanding, well, what does this really mean? Are there any other factors? I mean, a great example is where Google was predicting the flu outbreak by the amount of people that were typing in. But actually what they didn't realise, that people were just interested because there was a flu outbreak somewhere else. So again, there's an enormous shift when, if you're launching a system or a product, I think, as I said before, there's a need to already, before you've launched, to think about what its next iteration will be, because none of these systems stay the same. And I think Facebook is a great example. If you see how much that has changed and evolved, but the business model also has changed and evolved. It's had to. If you see other services which didn't, they don't last more than maybe 2 years, and that seems to be getting shorter. I think maybe one of the fundamental kind of business development aspects that I find so interesting is really thinking on a kind of continuous growth mindset. So rather than, again, this object-oriented, we're building a product, maybe it's a product with a service, but we're going to launch it. And the traditional way of working is then, okay, we've launched it, now we've got customer service to deal with when things maybe go wrong. That actually, in all of these kind of areas, is the launch point is when your creativity really starts. Because that's when your engagement with your customers, your users, or your other stakeholders begins. That's where your content maybe gets created, and then you start seeing what kind of content are we having, what do we need to actually enable that content to have more meaning, to have more value, to grow more. And so the business model is not just about how are we charging people for this object. It's more about what are we launching, what are we starting, and how is it growing? How is our relationship growing? How is the content growing? And ultimately the value. And then, only then, is, and then what's the transaction? Who's getting what from who, when and where? And it's ongoing. You can't just chuck it out there and then go off and start the next product. It's like, okay, now we've started, now we have to nurture it through. And it's also very similar to the exact same principle behind the smart cities or the smart lighting. You install the infrastructure, and it's no longer that it goes to maintenance and keeping everything running. It's actually, now we have a system, now we actually need to design how it behaves and how it behaves in the best way so that we reduce our energy costs, but we actually improve the environment. And you are only able to do that by doing it iteratively, over and over again. Try something out. It's new, we don't know. Try it, see it, get feedback. That didn't work, let's try something else, let's adapt it. Oh, that worked for 2 years, but people have changed. We now have to change and grow, we have to add something else. So it's alive.